But it was hard, and so the line you refer to, especially towards the end, it was really beginning to eat at me. I was feeling demoralized to some degree because we were seeing bad things happen, anti-gay amendments in the States, public opinion wasn't changing. But really, I was also asking myself, am I not doing a good enough job? If someone else were in this job who were stronger or braver, would they have said something or worked their magic and gotten the president to where we needed him to get? So it was hard, but the sentences that come next are that I stayed fundamentally because I believed in Barack Obama. I remember that line from the 2004 speech in Boston where he said, "We have gay friends in the red states," and I really did have faith, and later I would have proof that he had his eyes on sort of this, as Dr. King says, the moral arc of the universe, and was thinking about the long picture and how best to get us there, which turns out he was.
Rumana, you kind of have a similar moment in your chapter where you talk about kind of what it was like for you as a Muslim American who covers her head after 9/11, what you faced, what you then felt you owed your community at the White House, and the struggles you had about inaction at the White House, and it really comes to bear in a moment when the president goes and visits a mosque. The line I have for you is, there is no progress without struggle.
So, I mean, for me personally, it's like a lot of my experience that led me to the White House was from loss and struggle. That was losing family members, it was being 12 years old and being in an interrogation room at the airport. And a lot of my time at the White House, I didn't think that I was going to end up at the White House. As someone who hated government from a young age, it kind of was an accident ending up there. It was really believing in this first really black president. That was a big reason why I wanted to go intern for him. But it was also the message that he had to share that was empowering and that gave me hope. And this piece of hope, I think, has been a factor throughout my time at the White House, and something that I really wanted to make sure that we were sharing through the chapter that I wrote. And what ended up happening is, within the White House, similar to Gautam, there were a lot of days that I wanted to leave. There were many, many moments that I thought about leaving. And a lot of people who knew the challenges that I went through within those years was like, well, why didn't you just leave then? And the reason why I didn't leave was because through a lot of the work that I did, I got to meet these incredible individuals across the US and from around the world that really gave me inspiration. And one of the projects that we got to work on was Champions of Change. And really what that was, it was meeting people who are working on gun violence prevention, it's meeting people who are working on STEM education for girls, girls of color. And you hear these people's stories and you realize that their struggles are so much greater than yours. And I think it was the first time that I felt like I had others to share my struggle with. And it was a constant reminder for me that these people are still fighting, they're still working really hard on the ground, they're not getting any recognition or known by anyone, but they're continuing to do what they're passionate about. And that was a good inspiration for me to keep going and doing what I was doing. For the chapter that I cover, as I was writing the chapter and when Gautam asked me to write this chapter, it was in the summer after I left the White House. And so I was in a pretty negative space. I was struggling to hang on to every bit of hope that I could. Even with the President Obama's mosque visit that took place, the reason why it took place was actually because I was teaching a group of third grade girls at my Sunday school, and it was terrifying to see the depression and fear that they were facing. And being able to have Obama go to a mosque and give a speech that shared the sentiments that I needed to hear when I was 11 or 12 was really empowering. And I knew that his speech wasn't going to resolve racism. I knew it wasn't going to resolve the hate crimes that were spiking at that time. I myself was almost hit by a car last year by somebody who was cursing at me as he passed by. But seeing these kids, because basically where Obama gave his speech in the mosque, there was an auditorium filled with like almost 200 to 300 kids. Seeing them just so excited, and a few of them came up to me afterwards and they were like, finally somebody said something. And it was personal for me. Like, working on the Muslim American issues was actually only 1/4 of my portfolio during my time at the White House, but it was the most personal to me because of what I went through as a child. And although I didn't get to work on the speech, I know Aneesh has worked on speeches before, being able to work with the speechwriter and actually tell him and think about, what did I need to hear, what did I need to be reminded of, that I belonged in this country and that I didn't have to pick between being Muslim or American, but that I could be both. post White House, just really quickly on that point of, there is no progress without struggle. So last summer, I was in a pretty negative space, and I was having a hard time. And the one last story that I do want to share is this whole idea of holding on to hope and not being so privileged to think that you can let go of hope. I got an email from a Cuban American, Cuenta Propista, a woman who I had met, and she literally has nothing. They still live in a society where they live on rations. We got to see the way that they live, and their struggles are real. And she sent me an email saying, I just want to tell you that this is really hard, this is really depressing, and this is going to make our lives, what Trump is doing is going to make our lives 10 times harder. But I just want to let you know that the hope and the inspiration that you and President Obama have given us, no one is going to take it away from us, and we're going to keep fighting for it no matter what. And that was such a reminder of our struggle that we're all talking about is relative. There are people out there who are suffering 100 times harder than we are. I'm very privileged to be among a cohort of a program here where I've heard stories of what people are going through in Nicaragua, and that's been a learning experience for me. So I think it's a good reminder that progress will happen, but it's going to take struggle, it's going to take a lot of pain, but the pendulum will swing back.
And I think what we're seeing now also is that progress once attained is not forever secured. Yeah. And there's an activism that has to just be recurring in order to protect it. And I think that's something that hopefully all of us take to heart as we look at where we were and where we are and how we get back to where we were. Ned, 9/11 was the frame for your chapter as well. And what I thought was most interesting is how you talk about fear and the role fear played in how President Bush and then President Obama thought about national security, and how, for you, that changed over the course of working for President Obama. The line for you is, Nicholas need not live in a world of corrupting and corrosive fear, and President Obama had shown him and all Americans how it could be done.
That's actually the last line in my chapter, and in some ways my chapter ends where it began, with only about 16 years in between, very formative years both for me personally and I think for our country as a whole. The reference to Nicholas is, it goes back to September 11, 2001, and as I recount in the chapter, I was a freshman at Georgetown University. I'd been at school in Washington, D.C. for some 2 whole weeks at that point. And my sister at the time was 9 months pregnant. And so being away from home for the first time, compounded by expecting to miss the arrival of your first nephew, it had me in a state. And so the phone rings that morning, of course, and bittersweet, because I expected to be my family calling to say, your nephew's arrived, but you missed him, but you'll meet him soon. Obviously, the phone call that came that day was something very different. And then the chapter recounts from that day to my path to the CIA, which I started shortly after college, and the story that I told my family, my friends, the world around me about this being a personal mission of dedication, of commitment to public service, of me wanting to join in this effort. But what I really didn't recognize until later, and having worked these issues for years, both at the CIA and then later at the White House, was that both for me and for the country as a whole, there was a great deal of fear in all of our actions, both at the personal level and at the macro level. At the personal level, every day I sort of thought about that day, and it was certainly a motivation for me in my work. And at the macro level, I think for the first time, in Barack Obama as the Democratic nominee in 2008, we heard someone articulate that, when a country is running scared, when a country is fueled by fear, we make mistakes. And we don't always act with our judgment intact, and we don't always follow the right course. And we heard a lot about that from Barack Obama on the campaign trail in 2008. And frankly, I was skeptical because I was at a place that wanted to do, rightly so, I think, everything that could be done to protect us. And there was a lot of skepticism from this, first-time presidential contender who was saying that we should halt various tactics and reverse some of what we'd been doing since 9/11 under his predecessor. And it wasn't only until working under President Obama, seeing his decisions, taking part in aspects of our counterterrorism program, that I began to understand that look, we can address this threat and we can level set and take on the threat of terrorism and frankly every other threat we face by dealing with them rationally, by dealing with them with what we know works. And so fast forward 16 years and 3 years of my career spent in the White House working some of these issues under President Obama. And one of the final times I visited the Oval Office, it was to bring my family in. And so my mother, my sister, my brother-in-law, and my 2 nephews, the oldest being Nicholas, and a younger nephew who was born a couple of years later. And so seeing President Obama and my oldest nephew come face to face and shake hands, for me, that story came full circle.
Yeah, a lot of the chapters, it's funny, a lot of us ended our chapters with this departure photo. When you leave the White House, you get a slot on the calendar to actually bring your parents, your wife, your in-laws, whoever, in. And it really hit home, I think, for a lot of us, that connection to our family story and what we were doing at the White House. It really resonated. Raina, your chapter talks about this historic visit from President Obama to Alaska, to where you grew up. And I thought what was most interesting about it was we often think of advocacy as something that is Washington, D.C. centric. How do we get more voices in the room? How do we impact Washington, D.C. conversations? And I felt like your chapter really made the case for why public officials, including and maybe especially the president, need to get out of Washington, D.C. and go meet often underrepresented groups where they live. See what their life is like, meet them where they are every day to best understand what they need, what their hopes are, what their aspirations are. So the line I have for you in the context of kind of that trip in your chapter is, this was leadership that I recognized not from Washington, but from my own community.
Yeah, thank you, Aneesh. So my chapter, and when Gautam first reached out about the book, and we were kind of having these conversations about, what topics should I cover, what shouldn't I cover, we had kind of 2 different topics on the radar. One was Alaska, and one was the president's trip to Standing Rock Reservation in 2014. We landed on Alaska probably because anybody who knows me personally knows that I'm Alaskan and Alaska Native, and that those are the most important parts of who I am, and always have been, always will be. And you could imagine that with that foundational identity, it was incredibly impactful in my life to have, in 2015, been able to organize a trip for the president to go to Alaska. And as Aneesh said, we just didn't get that many high-level visits in Alaska. I mean, it's far away, we have a pretty small population, and so we generally just don't get a whole lot of folks who are willing to come visit and kind of expend the time and the resources to do that. And so when I started the conversation within the White House about getting the president to come and visit Alaska, we were kind of in the midst of a lot of the Arctic policy work, Arctic climate policy work. We were the head of the Arctic Council, which was a worldwide body. And we really wanted to do something really big to try to combat climate change, because in the Arctic of the world and the Antarctic, you can see the impacts of climate change most flagrantly. And so during this period, I kind of took some initiative to push us a little bit further along, getting us to Alaska. It took about a year before the idea really sunk in, and we were able to schedule it. And so for me, I mean, just even approaching a trip like that was huge, right? I didn't know where to start when it first came about, because our state's not huge population-wise. We're really large geographically. We're about 1 person per square mile on average. I mean, people are focused, within Anchorage, so it's not actually 1 person per square mile, thankfully. Make it very difficult to visit people. But it's very large, and so you have, parts of the state which are rainforest. You have parts of the state which are permafrost, right? So like the ground never freezes. There are no trees. And so we have this incredibly diverse state. And so when I approached it, I thought, listen, we've got to ensure that we have the indigenous voice in the conversation. And it wasn't just because I'm Alaska Native or that's part of my portfolio, but the president himself, because of who he is, and because he always cared so much about smaller populations, no matter how small a population, if the needs were great, he thought that was worth paying attention to. And that included indigenous peoples in this country. And so he took initiative to have indigenous people in his administration, and not just kind of here and there, but he had a policy where every single cabinet level agency had an indigenous person or an advisor to the secretary. And so we had this wonderful, wonderful support. And so I thought, listen, if we're going to go to Alaska, he's going to do his visits to Anchorage and to, the major fishing community near Anchorage, but he should really go into rural Alaska, because who's been to Alaska in this room? Okay, just a couple of people. Well, you should visit, first of all. It's lovely. But to get around Alaska, you really have to take small planes and alternative modes of transportation, because our road system is literally one tiny loop in the kind of center of the state, and the rest is not, there are no roads. So essentially, to get him out to rural Alaska would be precedent setting, for sure. And also, we had never had a sitting president travel above the Arctic Circle. And so that was kind of on our bucket list as well. And so we were able to do both those things. And he got to interact with young people, which he absolutely loves. He loves interacting with high school students and young kids. And so we had that component. He interacted with Native elders and with the leadership of the state. And really his way of connecting with people is unlike what you typically see from politicians who are as high level as he is, right? Like, he didn't really grow up in politics. And we were talking about this earlier, that he was just, until recently, before he was elected, was basically unknown nationally, right? So he still had that humility, which he still has, where he can talk to people as people, right? It's not like he's giving political lines. He's trying to be present, and he's trying to listen, and he does listen. And so one thing that I noticed in my time working for him in the White House was that he always led from the heart, and he always led with the best interests of every population in mind. You can't always please everybody, but for him, he really cared about helping those smaller populations that were oftentimes ignored, because he thought there were no groups that were more important than any others for him. And so when the needs were great, he wanted to focus there. And that's a leadership we don't often see in Washington, D.C., where it's usually a numbers game. People are crunching polls and saying, okay, here's our path of least resistance to re-election or to election. That was not how he operated. He operated in a very authentic way. And when I saw his mode of operating, it reminded me of my grandfather, which is what this quote is about, who was the last traditional chief of our village in Alaska. And unlike the role of a leader in Western society, the role of a leader in our society was based not on being granted a title. It was really based on what your actions stated. So because my grandfather took care of the entire village, because he made sure everybody was fed, everybody had a roof over their head, and he kind of cared for the village as someone who would kind of go around and speak with folks and really understand what was going on with them. So he basically assumed the title through his actions. And that's really what I saw from Barack Obama over the course of 8 years, was somebody who cared for other people, who cared for our country and every population. And I think that's what really made him a leader. And so that's what that quote is.
All right, I'm going to open it up for questions, and in the meantime, do 2 quick rounds. I'm going to ask for the coolest Obama personal anecdote everyone has. It can be Barack or Michelle, because I'm mindful that you guys are not here as much for us as you are for some good Obama stories. But before that, I do want to ask everyone to think of 1, 2 specific things that everyone in this room who looks at the world and sees this ocean of issues that they want to change. I think we all were blessed with a moment, at least a few of them, in the White House where we actually felt we did something, like something that mattered in terms of this country and where it was going. So what is the 1 or 2 specific things that people can do? And I'll start with Rumana, because, and with Gautam actually too, I think one thing that was interesting about your chapter, Gautam writes about don't ask, don't tell. And at the time, the opposition, as you write, was less about letting gay, lesbian, transgender people into the military, but if you did that, it would be hard then to push back on veterans not having full family benefits. Mm-hmm. So it's actually about marriage equality, even though it was about serving. And then you had Biden go on Meet the Press, and it was this very disorganized chain of events that actually led to progress. So given there is that chaos of how stuff happens, what can individuals specifically do? And you talked earlier today about the idea of, like, in this ocean, what are the right first steps? So I'll start with you. Yeah.
So I think when I think about what I was able to get done, I mean, I should first mention that everything that I did get done has all been reversed and is all gone. However, I think for those of you who watched the final year documentary, President Obama talks about this, and I think this is what I hold on to, and I think we all need to keep this in mind in whatever work we do. And I'm going to quote you, because you said this earlier. This is an Obama quote, which is, don't think so much about who you want to be, but what you're going to do. And in the documentary, Obama talks about how we often look at our scorecards of like what policies we got done, what we achieved, the things that we can actually calculate and point to. But it's not that stuff that actually matters. If I were to hold up my scorecard, it's all like red X'd right now. However, it's everything that you actually can't calculate. And that is the individuals that you've had an impact on. You may never know that one person who is in your audience or who you lifted up, they will have a multiplier effect to go on and empower others as well too. That is something that President Obama did throughout his presidency. I mean, every country that we traveled to, like I remember when we were in Vietnam with Obama, it's like you see the room full of these kids and you feel their energy and the fact that they're empowered to a whole different extent. No matter if they're living in a war-torn society or wherever they are, a lot of these people have been driven now to fight harder more than ever before. And that story that I mentioned earlier is a perfect example of that. For me with the mosque visit, and it's not just the mosque visit, but the gun violence prevention and all that, it's like these people know that they don't have a place to go to anymore at the White House, but they're all out there still fighting and doing great work. And I think one of the most resonating moments for me that I would actually almost put at level with one of my favorite Obama moments was when the father of a 7-year-old who was killed in Sandy Hook during our gun violence prevention event. He knew it was my last event that I was organizing before I left. He actually got up on stage and he broke into tears and he was like, I felt alone this whole time, but this is the first time that you've reminded me that I'm not alone, and I am more stronger more than ever to keep fighting for not only my son, but all the other kids and family members that are here today. And I think that's something to keep in mind is don't get so caught up on what big thing you want to get done, but rather what is the extent to which you can reach people and inspire them. And you may not see the change happen in your time, but it will happen if you empower kind of that next generation. And do you want us to share our favorite?
Well, let's go down on the so Ned, specific things that people can do to change the world. Be specific.
30 seconds. Look, I think just generally the most important thing we can do is not get discouraged and to stay engaged. I think there's a tendency today to allow the headlines, to allow sort of the daily noise distract us from what we have all seen, what we all know we're capable of, what we all know that collectively when we put our minds and hearts into something that we can achieve. And I think the real fear is that we allow those who seek to disempower, those who seek to disenfranchise, both literally and metaphorically, to gain the upper hand by buying into what they're trying to sell. And so I think a school like this, programs like this, forums like this is what we need to continue to do, and we need to see more of it across the country and not just Cambridge, Massachusetts.
Great.
What I would say, and I've said this recently a couple times too, but I would work on understanding the other side of your opinion and who's on the other side of your opinion, people who don't agree with you. I think we've gotten into a place in our country where it's incredibly awkward and uncomfortable to hear somebody push back against ideas that you hold very near and dear emotionally. And it's created this polarization in our country among, with many other factors contributing to it, but we have a really hard time trying to cut through the emotions that we attach to these issues and have conversations that are civil. And so I feel like what I'm trying to do, and this is a struggle for me as well, is working on that. How can I better engage folks who don't have my same opinion or perhaps have the opposite opinion, and make sure that we're including them in the conversation, because there are people out there who are willing to have that civil conversation. Maybe not everybody, but there are people out there, and we need to really empower and lean into that group of people to have those conversations. I was just at a women's climate conference a couple days ago in Seattle, and we talked about this because there was a very mixed group of people. We had the head of, BP Alaska, we had progressive activists in the room, so it was this, mixed group of folks, and it was not a comfortable conversation. There were a lot of really hard moments, but I think when we came out of that session, after like one full day of that conversation, when we came out of that conversation, we all felt a lot stronger, and like we didn't have anger in the situation, right? We didn't have anger coming out of that. What we had was a feeling of empowerment. And we have different worldviews, but we can still respect that, we all have the same basic American values of respect for one another. And I feel like we need to bring that back into the conversation. And it's really hard in the time, I hate to say it, Aneesh, of Facebook and social media, and things just get very polarized very quickly, and there's a sense of anonymity as well. But bringing that civility back into the conversation is something that I think each and every one of us could lean into doing.
So one of the things that you'll see throughout the book, especially on the chapters, my chapter, which is about marriage equality, and the chapters about immigration reform, sexual assault prevention, is that there's sometimes this tension between activism and government. Many of us were activists before we came into government. And most of the time it's a false tension, or it's a tension that shouldn't be there. My experience has been that being in government makes me now a better advocate on the outside. And President Obama used to talk about this all the time, that real lasting change requires both people willing to work within systems to change them and speak up, as well as the activists who are going to knock down your door and say, I demand change now. And so I think sometimes, especially when we're talking about a lot of these issues, it's easy to, if you're an activist, to say everyone who works in government is a sellout. And if you're in government, to say, oh, those crazy activists don't understand how the system works. But especially for progress on issues of social justice and civil rights, we need to have both. And so I would encourage any of you who are using your time on campus to be good activists to really consider working within the systems too. It'll make you a better advocate and activist too.
Now that I'm approaching 40, I think I get to be the old guy. And if people remember John McLaughlin in the McLaughlin group, I guess I should be able to offer my own, which is I think you should not focus on scale. You can't change the world all at once. And so you pick one part of one issue and really feel that impact, and that will kind of give you motivation, and it gives you, as you talked about earlier, a grounding in the reality of how do you actually change the world for impact. We think that if we post or we go and say everything should change all at once, that we've done something, and we're just in a moment where no one needs more voices. People need more action, and action is a very specific series of steps that you have to do over a sustained period of time. Okay, coolest Obama moment. Who wants to go first?
So we planned my last year. We planned the Diwali celebration at the White House, and we got we were creative. We found out that Mrs. Obama loves the show So You Think You Can Dance, which I'm a huge fan of. Anyone else? So You Think You Can Dance? Great show. She loves it, and she
let the record show no hands went up. One person pointed at the screen.
Like studying.
And Gautam thought that was a hand and was very excited, but
no,
it wasn't a hand.
So we found out she liked the show, and so we were like, well, what if we brought in the Bollywood choreographer from the show, and we'll do a dance workshop. And there's this amazing photo, which is one of the most liked photos of, I think, 2013 or 14, I can't remember which, 2013, where it's the First Lady dancing in the East Wing with these black and brown and white kids around her, and a mix of races. And it is the most, for someone who never saw brown people working in government, never saw South Asians working in government, to have that moment was pretty cool. And she was really good.
Yeah.
So.
I think one of the cooler moments, and there were a lot of cool moments, so it's really hard to pick, but one of the cooler moments was going back to the Alaska trip, and we were all on the plane. We were all in Air Force One. We're in the smaller version of Air Force One because we really couldn't take the big one to rural Alaska. The runway's just not long enough, so it wasn't going to work out. But we were in Air Force One. We were flying way north of Anchorage, hundreds of miles. And we all knew that no sitting president had ever crossed the Arctic Circle in our nation's history. And so it was a really interesting moment, the moment that they came on the loudspeaker and we were all listening kind of, attentively. And they're like, we're now crossing the Arctic Circle. And it was just this, a crazy moment, which is a small thing really in the grand scheme, but it's one of those strange little nuggets of time when you realize that you're part of history and you're part of making that history. And it's just it was a very cool, interesting moment. And I mean, just being on Air Force One is a cool experience as well. And when we were leaving Alaska, this kind of goes to the president's kind of character and who he is, but instead of, kind of getting a debrief on, how we all did in our respective roles for the trip to make it a success, he sees me sitting there, getting ready to watch a movie or whatever. He comes over and he says, "How'd I do?" And I was like, "You did amazing," so, as always.
Sort of quintessential Obama moment that often strikes me. It was towards the end of the administration, and we were doing sort of a last series of meetings on big issues. And so we had a meeting on nuclear modernization and sort of our nuclear doctrine going forward, planning out decades. I think it was 30 years ahead, talking about the potential annihilation of all life on Earth, billions upon billions of dollars. And listening to President Obama, you certainly didn't forget that he wrote his thesis on nuclear deterrence as an undergraduate. I mean, the guy was, he knew everything thick and thin. It was clear that he had read all of his briefing papers and been president of the United States for 7+ years at that time. But as we were sort of all leaving the room, it was no one was quite sure how to end the conversation. And all of a sudden, the president just goes, "Wow, that was some real commander-in-chief shit right there." And so you were often reminded that he's brilliant, he knows it all, but at the same time, I think the weight and the power of the office never quite permeated, and he had this humility about him that even until the last day was still there.
I'm going to pick a personal one since there's so many. For me, it was actually the exit photo that I had with my family. So my mother is this very short, ultra-conservative, as in won't shake a guy's hand, none of that. So she prearranged with me. She was like, "Rumana, I'm going to stand furthest away from Obama because I don't want him putting his arm around me." And I was like, all right. And so we get in there, and I put out my hand to shake his hand, and he was like, "Girl, get over here and give me a hug. I know exactly what you've done, and I'm really happy and proud of you." And then my mom goes inside, and he was like, "Mom, you come right here and stand right next to me." And she goes, "Okay." And she runs over and puts her arm around, and I'm like, this is the one time where every Islamic rule that she abides by is going to fly out the window, and it's just for President Obama. But that was a really kind of memorable moment for me.
Did you talk to her about that after?
Oh yeah, of course I did. But she was like, "I know." She's like, "Don't tell anyone."
Oops.
Yeah.
Mine will be kind of similar to Ned's, which is I wrote a speech for him at the National Prayer Breakfast, and it was shortly after the second inaugural. He had been sworn in on the Bibles of Lincoln and of MLK. And so in the speech, I'm writing about just kind of what faith meant to those individuals in moments of crisis. And just as you do with people that are mythical, you write about them and you kind of talk to it, but not in a really humanizing way because they're mythical. It's hard to make them real people. And it was the only time I ever got a call from him at my desk. When the phone comes, you think it's his secretary telling you got to edit something, and he's on the phone. And I was just like, okay. Hey. And he really wanted me to, he's like, the shit they were dealing with. I mean, the stuff that these individuals were going through, how hard it was, because we talk about MLK after the church bombing and all the little girls who died and turning to faith, and Lincoln in the midst of the Civil War and the doubt that he had about what he was doing. And it humanized the presidency. It humanized Obama and how he thought about it. And I think we all touched on these themes of, he still had student debt. The guy had just been very recently of the normal world. And so how he brought that normalcy to the abnormality of the White House, but also to have him talk about peers who to all of us are these mythical, larger than life individuals as humans, and what the human experience was for them. It's unimaginable to think about what Lincoln thought when he was by himself at night as he saw the country coming apart. And we now know the end of the story, but in the midst of it, what that was just like as a human. And so that was something that I really took away from that call. And then at the end, he didn't have anything else to say, and I didn't want to waste his time, and I just kind of said goodbye and hung up on him, which was probably not the right thing to do. But it was always awkward to interact with the president because he's the president. All right, 6:44, so we've got time for questions. I've been told to remind you questions should be questions, which hopefully is intuitive by us calling them questions. Anyone have them? Can you go to one of the mics and just intro who you are?
Hello.
You're on.
Yep.
Hello. Okay. Yeah. My name is Drake Evan Johnson. I'm a first-year undergrad at Harvard College, and I'm just curious. I think a lot of us can draw hope from these different stories of the Obama administration and looking at the past and how things have worked out in the future. But I'm just curious how are we able to push that hope from inside of us out onto other people who still have deep doubts. And I know a lot of us in the future, as we graduate and go on, will have more opportunity or have different platforms to do this on, or some of us now. But I'm just curious, how do you get that hope from inside and help push it onto those outside so that they feel that comfort and that kind of, they feel that hope and they see that light?
Here you go. So what I would say to that is I think it's not necessarily just about looking internally, but what you're doing externally as well, being involved, interacting with people in your neighborhood, interacting with people who are outside of your neighborhood, and being civically engaged. I feel like those experiences tend to build hope, and they also build community, and I feel like that's what folks can do in their daily routine and in their daily tasks to really help themselves feel more connected to each other. Because I think that's part of what it is almost a disconnect between all of us as a group. And I think it's really kind of undermined the sense of hope that we thought that we had for so many years under Obama. But I really do think, like, whenever I do something that's civic-minded, that is engaging with other folks, trying to be helpful in my own way, that always makes me feel hopeful, and so that's what I would recommend.
In fact, just that one other thing is, I think too often we also look for hope and inspiration in the White House. And that's not the only place to find it, right? I think one of the things that Michael Strautmanis, who's a longtime aide to the president, who writes in this book too, one thing he said to many of us after the election is, we have to stop looking to Barack and Michelle Obama to save the world, right? And I think that is helpful advice, especially now, to look at some of the elected officials around the country who are doing amazing work in state capitals and as mayors, and to look at this new bench of leadership that's coming up, including a lot of women and people of color who are running for office and winning. And I think if you need examples of hope, we don't need to just look to Washington anymore, because there's less of it there, in my opinion.
I would also just add, to reinforce his point earlier, is last year when I was doing interviews, a lot of press actually were telling me, they're like, why are you so hopeful? Like, we're having a hard time finding the same hope that you have. And you have to just remind people that I think our generation, we really focus on the now. We kind of live in the moment. But we forget that there is a whole history behind us of people who have struggled 100 times more than we have. There are people who have been lynched. The civil rights movement, that's all you got to look at to see how far it's brought us today. And I think it's important to have those conversations and reminding them of that. And the other thing, to his point earlier, is that we should also make sure that we ourselves, because I think we lose hope when we look at all the negative things that are going on, and social media really feeds into that. And I think, personally, it makes me really depressed when I look at everything that's going on. Pick that one or two issues that you will commit to, that you will revolve your life around, and bring that other person to be a part of it with you. Like, make sure it's more than just words and putting out a tweet, but actual action. There are ways for you to get involved. Go do the research, go find out how to do it, and take your friend along to be a part of it with you. So I think it's about, like, and when you bring people to do it with you, that's gonna automatically bring that feeling of hope back.
The morning after the election, some of you may have heard this story, but the president sort of learned of an impromptu meeting close by the Oval Office in the West Wing, and so a bunch of us filed in the Oval Office. He just told us to come on over, so of course we did. And the most optimistic, cheeriest, brightest-eyed person in that room that morning was President Obama. And his staffers around him had tears in their eyes. Some were still crying. Some couldn't, look up. And what he said then has stuck with me, and it's a line that he had used before, but it never had quite that same degree of resonance. He said, history zigs and zags. It doesn't move in a straight line. And I think the only corollary to that he didn't add then, but I think we've heard him talk about it previously, is that we can help contour those zigs and zags, and we can each play a small role, but I think there also is perspective to be had, and if we lose that perspective, it will be much easier to get lost in despair when really progress has been on the march.
And to the point about, it's hard. Right now is a hard time, but Obama literally had on his desk a sign that said, "Hard things are hard." I think Axe gave it to him. I forget who gave it to him. This is a moment. I mean, you all are blessed to be alive in what I think is the most interesting moment in all of human history. In this country, we are debating the most fundamental things as to who we are. That's there for you to shape. And then I firmly believe we're in the second inning of technology and how it is going to remake the world. And so there is so much impact to be had out there that's outsized from other moments and other generations that I would derive some sense of empowerment and urgency to be part of it, because it will get shaped. I mean, the other answer to that question is, what's the alternative? If you're not out there advocating for the things you believe in, if you're not out there shaping America into the country you want, others will. And so you got to be out there, and you've got to always, and I think the point of the book is to remind us, like, we've all lived through crushing whiplash to go from the world that we thought we were creating to the world that then came after. But it did just happen a few years ago. And we were at the precipice, I think a lot of us felt, of really America becoming a society like the human history has not seen, of pluralism, of representation, and that's all there. And the demographics in this country really provide consistent momentum to where we could go. But it's going to be about who shows up. You have to be in the arena. Do you mind going to the mic? No, I don't mind. Yeah.
Hi, my name is Warren Nagler. I'm a MBA 1988 class secretary at Harvard Business School. I was involved in a White House council in 2011, 2012, and so I'm not going to talk about that, but my question kind of relates to that. In those years, it seemed like, and also I want to mention Michelle Robinson was in my graduating class across the aisle on commencement day. But I was wondering, I think an important thing in an environment like the White House is where you can be very insulated, as we get very insulated in corporate business. And certainly in the council I was on, I was wondering what were other ways that you were able to directly connect with the people and provide the president and his key advisors with, information about what was very important to us and what our opinions were, so that we, at least in some way, we were represented.
I'll just quickly start by saying the coolest part of being a presidential speechwriter is not the writing for the president. It's that you get to call up the people the president's going to talk about in his speech, and you get to hear from them their stories, their hopes, their aspirations, and then you get to weave them in to a speech where the president is telling them how they're representative of the American story. So I, at least as a speechwriter, for every speech got to talk to people for whom these were real life issues, and that was always one of the best parts of the job.
I would add, so I started off in the Office of Presidential Correspondence, and that's where you get the hundreds and thousands of letters that come in from across the US, and you get a glimpse into the struggles that your everyday American family is going through. And in fact, when I was an intern, one of my classmates, or one of the fellow interns, she's actually the one who picked out the letter from Natoma Canfield, who was fighting cancer, and actually became the letter that Obama kept in his pocket and would read out to congressional members. Her story became the driving force behind healthcare reform. And I think those of us who worked in the Office of Public Engagement, I always felt, when I was there, I always felt like my role was only to serve people on the outside. Like, my full-time job was organizing everyone on the outside, of how to strategically get them to the right individuals inside, to influence people inside. And I think that was a real, great privilege of the role that we played, to make sure that we were keeping our fellow colleagues in line, to be responsive, and to make sure that we're reminding them that they're serving the American people. It sounds a little convoluted, but sometimes I felt like I was working for the outside folks to bring them on the inside. And a lot of it literally was telling them, hey, call this person right now, write this email, push them on these points. These are the points that you need to bring up with them. So we gave them a lot of kind of inside strategy to help them out and empower what they were doing. I feel like the LGBT movement, Gautam may not give himself as much credit, but in terms of connecting all these groups and resources, that really happened because people like Gautam dedicated so much time and effort into bringing them all together and helping them strategize and empowering them in the process.
So I always worked on the National Security Council, which is probably the most insulated place of the White House. It felt wide open compared to the CIA, but it's all relative, I suppose. But even then, we would bring in outside experts, we'd bring in academics, we'd bring in human rights activists to hear their perspective from industry as well. But I think what struck me most about sort of getting that outside perspective was when we traveled, and especially when we traveled overseas. The highlight of the trip for me, for a lot of my colleagues, from what I gather for the president, would be his meetings with young leaders around the world, and some of the signature programs that he started in office, where there would be an arena filled with thousands upon thousands of leaders wherever we were, and you couldn't leave that session without feeling energized and optimistic and sort of refreshed, knowing that there are bright ideas out there, and there are bright messengers and leaders who will see that forward. And so I think that was a source of inspiration for all of us that may not have directly translated into some sort of firm policy, but I think it was a sense of outside counsel itself.
And can I just add in, to give you guys a sense of how insulated it could get in there, Ned and I sat right next to each other where we were just an arm's length away, and I was sitting in a man cave with him and Ben Rhodes, and our ceilings were right above us, and at 8 p.m. every day, we could hear all the mice just like running above us. So aside from being insulated, in terms of information, physically, no windows, nothing. Right. And that's where we're actually desperate to get people on the outside to come in.
The mice lobby.
Yes.
Yeah. They broke through.
Yeah.
Thank you for your healthcare work.
Yeah.
I'm a recent cancer survivor. So thank you.
Congratulations. That was, I was at Treasury when we had the financial crisis the first few years, and I will say the pivot to healthcare was like a true master class in how you prioritize policy initiatives, because the president did that, and it really shifted everything. And so there was probably bigger efforts we could have done on the recovery front, a more robust regulatory framework we could have put in place on the financial front. But he had this window that he thought with the Congress that we had that we could get something big done. And it was probably and I think it went down. I mean, the Syria one was another hard decision, but it was a real call. I mean, it was that commander-in-chief level call where I don't know that all presidents would have done that in that moment. We got time for one more question.
Excuse me. I'm a first year. Wait, let's see if I can. I'm a first-year student here at Harvard, and I'm wondering, I know you can't read his mind, but I'm curious, do you think Obama really did not believe in marriage equality when he first took office? I've listened to a number of speeches, and I know he said, he stated pretty emphatically that he believed in traditional marriage. He didn't believe, in marriage equality, but obviously now it's an obvious tenet of a Democratic platform. Do you think was he just saying that to appease voters? Did he really have a transformation? I'm curious what you think, what his mindset was.
Yeah, no, thanks for asking the hard question. The honest answer, and this is not a canned answer, this is the honest answer, which I've always said, is I really don't know. I was
Do you think he knows?
Who?
Obama. Do you think he has a
ask
sense?
Him. No, but I think like as a mid-level staffer in that kind of a job, as I joke about it, like I couldn't just write him a memo saying, sir, please evolve, or like, where are you really on this issue? I mean, you sort of read between the lines, and you talk to senior staff, and you try to divine what he's thinking or feeling on the issue, and you look at the past and you say, well, he said this at this point, like, what does it mean? I don't know. But I'll be honest with the second part of my answer, was just I don't care, because I think the result of it speaks for itself. And even though in the middle of the evolution it was challenging and frustrating for a lot of us, the benefit, whether it was intended or not, is that period of time gave millions of Americans the permission to evolve with him. And there were so many people who I knew in my life and knew professionally who started off being like, I like gay people. I've got a cousin who's lesbian. The guy cuts my hair. That's stereotypical. I don't want to use that. The coach at my kid's school is gay. Who knew gay people and were comfortable with the idea of gay rights, but just weren't sure where they were on marriage because it felt like something different to them. But by having that moment, that sort of space, and I would even say like the grace to sort of think about it and pray on it and talk to people, what we saw as a almost immediate result of his coming out for marriage equality was that the numbers shifted immediately. I mean, my colleague who ran the Office of National AIDS Policy said, who's also a gay man in a relationship, said, there was an unintended health impact of the president coming out for marriage equality because it gave people permission to talk about marriage and about their relationships and about their status, and it had a huge impact there too. So, like I said, I don't know. I don't particularly care, and I think the results speak for themselves.
And it's also worth remembering, I mean, the undercurrent of your question was kind of the politics of the country and how he was trying to navigate that. Like, this was a guy who had to be at perfection and actually delivered perfection in terms of the public figure he was as president in bringing the country together and what he represented as the first African-American president, the expectations that were on his shoulders, the scrutiny that was on both him and Michelle, and how they were the adults in the room. I mean, they just rose to that moment, again, just not that far removed from just being normal people. And to me, that's always one of the most remarkable things about what they did as president and first lady. Yeah.
Can you hear me? Yeah. So I'm Erin Rist. I'm a mid-career MPA alongside Rumana, and big fan club here of hers. She's one of us. So thank you for the evening of inspiration and hope. Can I count on any of you running for elected office, or can we encourage you to?
Some of us live in D.C.
I mean, Gautam's running a PAC right now, working with a lot of Indian American candidates.
I have no plans to run for office, but I will say if I were to, that I would do it. I would want to be a mayor, because I think like at the city level is where you actually have the most direct impact on people's lives. I mean, you don't need to do that in Congress, and you're not doing it in Congress. So.
And I would just add, actually, with the November elections coming up, I think it's important to keep in mind that you don't have to be running for office, but every single one of you here should be taking your own butts to vote, but also get all your friends to go as well too.
Yeah.
And in terms of running for office, I mean, I've said this to a lot of our friends, is that you don't have to decide that right now. That may come organically later down the road. I mean, if there's anything to take away from all the young people that are running out there, that it is a possibility. There is no age limit. There is no gender limit. There is nothing out there anymore that will hold you back. And you should take your frustrations, your anger, and turn it into something positive. If that's going to be for you to run for office down the line, then great, do it. But for now, every single one of you in this room, you should be getting your families, your friends, and everybody to go out there and vote in November. No excuses at all. Don't tell me you don't have any hope. Don't tell me that your vote won't count. Cut that crap. I don't want to hear any of that. And then this is what I will say is, like, in my mind, anyone who tells me that, you're being a privileged person. And if you don't want to sound like that privileged ass who says, oh, well, I don't have hope, or my vote's not going to count, we don't have space for that anymore. And we really need everyone to go out there and play their part.
And I would say run. I think everyone should run. I think all of us should run. I mean, I think it goes back to that Obama point of what do you want to do, not what do you want to be. And for me, at least right now, I think technology is this force to shape, and the government is unfortunately not even at the table in trying to do that. And so doing that within the private sector, but being able to bring that to government. But yes, everyone should run. It should not seem like this thing that only certain people do, or that isn't the way that you can best affect government. Like, the people that are in government best affect government, and those are the people that ran. So everyone should run, I think.
Yeah. I mean, I think it's important to run, but I myself, I have no current plans to run. I think it would have to be for the right reasons, because honestly, a lot of us have worked on campaigns. It's really hard to do. It's very stressful. I think it takes years off your life. I mean, so I think it's a really heavy decision, and I think it's got to be the right time. And if the stars ever perfectly aligned, maybe. But I think for me, the bar just keeps on getting higher in terms of my personal will to run for office, because it as our politics kind of get more and more complicated, it just seems a little bit less like something I want to do. But I do encourage everybody else to run every day, and I'm actively working on campaigns from the outside. So I'll just say that.
I'm going to use moderator prerogative and do one last question, because I've got my high school teachers here. Mr. Murphy, who was, well, first of all, awesome. Mrs. Goddard's birthday is today, so we should say collectively happy birthday. And Mr. Murphy, for people who most of you don't know, was our government teacher in high school, and used to teach us the book Hardball and all that happened in the White House. And I'll never forget, he was the one teacher that at one point we were complaining about something, and he said, "You all have the power. Do you know if you all walk out, if all the students walk out, the adults can't do anything. You have the power. You have to choose to exercise."
Wow.
That's big. Yeah.
You did then.
Yeah.
You still do.
Yeah.
And I think, as a comment, before I get to my question, what we appear to be seeing this voting cycle is all kinds of people getting involved, and let's hope there's a pink revolution or a blue revolution or whatever. That's what makes democracy work. It's not, it's you have to participate.
Yes.
Anyway, my question, I think Mr. Price talked about it, some others did, and you would meet with your outside sources on a particular issue and all that sort of thing. And now, obviously, that's a good thing. But I guess going back to hardball, keep your friends close and your enemies closer. Did you speak on these issues? Did you ever include your political enemies to find out what they were thinking, try to anticipate their arguments, and maybe reach some compromise? Was that part of the process or not?
So I write a little bit about this in the context of Don't Ask, Don't Tell. So just as a quick reminder, because this now seems like ages ago, but in 2010, Don't Ask, Don't Tell had been on the books for 17 years. Policy that said that gay, lesbian, and bisexual service members couldn't serve, or they couldn't talk. They could serve, but they couldn't talk about it or be asked about it. And at the start of that year, the president called for repeal in the State of the Union, and the Pentagon undertook a year-long study, which normally a year-long study means you were about to kill an issue and it will never see the light of day. But it was a game changer in a number of ways, and one of the reasons why was because we pulled in everyone who was for and against repeal of Don't Ask, Don't Tell, and we wanted to know, what's your research? Give us your data. Like, what do you think is going to happen if all of a sudden you have, gay service members serving openly? What is the worst possible scenario? And let's prepare for all those outcomes to the extent that we can. I mean, some of it is stigma and stereotype, but let's really get to the bottom of that. And we heard it was the largest ever survey of the United States military. 400,000 plus service members were surveyed and asked about their feelings about the repeal of Don't Ask, Don't Tell. And, invariably what you got were, a lot of things that were based in stereotype. But then you got a lot of people who were just like, oh, I know a gay guy who's in my unit. Like, what's the big deal? But it was a helpful exercise to do that and to have answers for all those questions, and then to go to the Senate Armed Services Committee and say, Senator Sessions, we have answers to all of your concerns about men in showers together. So it's always the showers. They're always worried about the showers. Showers or bathrooms. It's like, what are you guys spending your time on?
Well, good thing Senator Sessions never went on to any other role in government. Yeah. What about, as you worked with the Muslim community and the people that...
in terms of, you said in terms of people who were didn't share the same view, right? Muslim community one's hard to think of. Cuba, for sure. We definitely had people from the other side of the aisle on that, Republicans as well, but also people who just were absolutely against us advancing our relations with Cuba. But it was really still important to have them be a part of that conversation, to make sure that we were trying to balance both sides of the views, because the whole, the civil society in Cuba is definitely still going through a lot of struggles, and the human rights issues is really big there. So we always had people from different sides. I mean, also on the Iran deal, we always were talking to people who were absolutely against it. So yeah.
And thank you for your service.
With that, I will say on behalf of all of us, thank you for coming. I think it shows that you care about this country and that you think it's worth fighting for. So I hope you get to have an experience like we had.